Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely shift our perspective on something we've literally all experienced. Usually, when your body temperature spikes, you probably view it as the ultimate enemy, right? You rush straight to the medicine cabinet to fight it off. But what if I told you that this heat is actually a highly sophisticated biological defense mechanism? Over the next few minutes, we're going to decode the biological blueprint of fever, totally transforming how you understand your body's most powerful alarm system.
Okay, so here's a quick roadmap of what we're covering today. First, we'll define what a fever actually is. Then we'll look at the mechanism of fever, dive into the clinical benchmarks, map out the stages of fever, break down the different types of fever, and finally, wrap it all up with a quick summary.
All right, let's jump right into Chapter 1, Fever.
So, let's clear up a massive misconception right out of the gate. A fever, which is medically known as pyrexia, by the way, is absolutely not a disease itself. Nope, it's actually a calculated sign of disease. Think of it less like an invading army and way more like a blaring siren letting you know your body is going to war. This biological alarm officially kicks in when your internal temperature rises above 38 degrees Celsius. That is the exact threshold where your body essentially locks the doors and turns up the heat on unwanted guests.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, the mechanism of fever.
So how exactly does your internal thermostat know it's time to change the temperature? Well, it's through this brilliant process we call the thermostat hijack. Normally, your brain's climate control center, a tiny little region called the hypothalamus, maintains your body at a super comfortable 37 degrees Celsius. But when an infection hits, your immune cells spot the invaders and immediately send up chemical warning flares. We call these biochemical hackers pyrogens. Once these pyrogens reach the hypothalamus, they literally hijack the settings. They trick the brain into deciding that 37 degrees is just too cold, shifting that target temperature higher specifically to fry those invading microorganisms.
Now for Chapter 3, clinical benchmarks.
Because, as you might guess, not all fevers are created equal. Medical professionals actually use very specific temperature ranges, usually in Fahrenheit, to track the intensity of this internal battle. It starts at low pyrexia, which hovers right between 99 and 100 degrees. From there, we move into moderate pyrexia, stretching from 100 to 103 degrees. Then high pyrexia, pushing things from 103 up to 105, and finally, anything escalating above 105 degrees is classified as hyperpyrexia, which is a really severe physiological state. Now, as a quick aside, medical opinions can vary just a tiny bit on the exact thresholds. For instance, some folks consider anything strictly over 100.4 degrees as the true starting line for moderate pyrexia. But overall, this framework gives us a fantastic baseline for gauging how hard the body is fighting.
Which brings us to Chapter 4, the stages of fever.
You see, a fever isn't just some static number on a thermometer. It's a dynamic, unfolding event. Every single fever follows a surprisingly strict timeline. First up is the onset, or invasion phase, where the body temperature starts its upward climb. Next, we hit the peak, clinically known as the fastigium or stadium phase. During this stage, the temperature hits its highest necessary level and stays fiercely constant while the immune system battles the infection. And finally, once the tide turns, we enter the decline or defervescence phase, where the temperature ultimately drops back down to normal.
But I've got to warn you, this decline phase can be incredibly tricky. When a fever drops suddenly, it's called a crisis. But doctors always have to contrast a true crisis with a false crisis. In a true crisis, the sudden drop in body temp comes with a real, visible improvement in how the patient is actually doing. The battle is being won. A false crisis, on the other hand, is super high stakes. The temperature drops rapidly, sure, but the patient remains dangerously sick. And this is almost always followed by another massive, dangerous spike in temperature. It's essentially a biological fake-out.
Alternatively, rather than a sudden, dramatic drop, the fever might resolve through something called lysis. Basically, this is a much more gradual decrease in body temperature. If you were looking at a chart, it resolves in this slow, steady, zigzagging pattern over time. And crucially, just like a true crisis, lysis is accompanied by a steady improvement in the patient's overall condition as they slowly but surely recover.
Let's pivot to Chapter 5, types of fever.
This is fascinating. Fevers actually present in beautifully distinct patterns depending on the exact type of invader your body's fighting. Medical detectives will look really closely at how a temperature fluctuates over a 24-hour window. For instance, a continuous fever varies by less than 2 degrees and just stays high. That's a classic fingerprint of typhoid fever.
A remittent fever fluctuates by more than 2 degrees but never quite returns to normal, which will often see in conditions like endocarditis. Then you have an intermittent fever, which has these massive swings that actually return all the way down to baseline before spiking back up. That is the absolute hallmark of malaria. And finally, a hectic or septic fever shows a gigantic swinging gap of more than 3 degrees Celsius, pointing toward really severe infections like septicemia.
And beyond those, we also see highly specific, almost behavioral types of fevers. Take an inverse fever, for example. This one totally defies the usual rules, uniquely peaking in the morning while dropping in the evening, a strong indicator of miliary tuberculosis. Then you've got relapsing fever, featuring days of illness followed by days of complete normalcy, only for the fever to return again. There's also PUO, or pyrexia of unknown origin, which is basically the ultimate medical mystery category, a fever over 38 degrees that remains completely undiagnosed even after 3 weeks of deep hospital investigation. Oh, and finally, the dramatic rigor type. This one cycles heavily and violently through 3 distinct stages: a shivering cold stage, an intense hot stage, and a profuse sweating stage.
All right, we've covered a lot. Let's move to Chapter 6, Summarization. Let's tie all of this complex biology together, shall we? Here are the absolute core takeaways from our explainer today. Number 1, fever is a calculated biological sign and a defense mechanism, definitely not the disease itself. Number 2, it's triggered by that brilliant thermostat hijacked, where pyrogens rewrite the rules in your hypothalamus. Number 3, we can categorize it clinically by severity, ranging from low pyrexia all the way up to hyperpyrexia. Number 4, it's a dynamic event, progressing predictably through onset, fastigium, and decline. And number 5, a fever presents in distinct clinical patterns, whether continuous, intermittent, or relapsing, acting as an incredible diagnostic tool to identify exactly what infection you're fighting.
So, knowing everything we just covered about the thermostat hijack, the clinical stages, and your immune system's absolute genius tactical response, I want to leave you with a question. The very next time your temperature rises, will you simply view it as an irritating illness? Or will you recognize it as a sign that your body's complex, beautifully designed biological blueprint is actively fighting to protect you? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious out there, and I'll see you next time.